The silence between goodbye and moving on. The house was no longer a home. It was a collection of echoes. Every footstep Vesper took across the hardwood floors sounded like a question that no one was left to answer. She sat in the center of the living room, surrounded by towers of brown cardboard, wondering how a whole life could be folded into boxes. The air tasted of dust and the lingering scent of cedarwood, a ghost of a person who was no longer there. In the bottom of a half-packed crate, Vesper found the small blue glass bird. It was cold against her palm, a fragile thing that had once sat on the windowsill, catching the morning light. She remembered the day it was bought, the laughter that had accompanied the purchase, and the way the sun had turned the glass into a sapphire spark. Now, the glass was just glass, and the laughter was a memory she couldn't quite reach. A soft knock at the doorframe broke the stillness. Soren stood there, his silhouette framed by the hallway's dim light. He didn't ask if she was okay. They both knew the answer to that. Instead, he simply waited, leaning against the wood, offering the kind of presence that didn't demand words. Vesper looked up, her eyes tracing the familiar lines of his face, finding a small anchor in the rising tide of her grief. They moved to the back porch, where the sky was a bruised purple, fading into the gray of the approaching dusk. They sat on the wooden steps, the space between them filled with the rhythmic chirping of crickets. The silence wasn't awkward, but it was heavy, a thick, invisible veil that separated the world they used to know from the one they were forced to inhabit now. Vesper opened her mouth to speak, to tell him about the glass bird or the way the kitchen felt too big, but the words caught in her throat like dry leaves. She realized that some grief is too large for language. It exists in the marrow, in the way the wind pulls at your hair, and in the sharp intake of breath when you forget, for a split second, that everything has changed. Soren reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he let it rest gently on Vesper's shoulder. It was a brief contact, a bridge built across the quiet. He didn't try to pull her out of her sadness, he simply sat in it with her. In that moment, the silence felt a little less like an ending, and a little more like a breath being held. "The tide is coming in," Soren said softly, his voice barely a whisper against the evening breeze. He stood up and began to walk down the sandy path that led toward the shore. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He knew the pull of the water would eventually bring her there, just as it brought everything back to the start. Vesper followed, her boots sinking into the damp sand. She reached the edge of the water where the waves hissed as they dissolved into foam. In her hand, she still clutched the glass bird. She looked at the horizon, where the sea met the sky in a line so blurred it was impossible to tell where one began and the other ended. With a sharp, sudden movement, Vesper tossed the glass bird into the surf. They watched together as the blue speck vanished into the churning gray water. There was no splash, only the sound of the ocean reclaiming what was once hers. Soren stepped closer to her, his shoulder brushing hers, as the weight she had been carrying seemed to drift away with the current. The silence returned, but it had changed. It was no longer the heavy silence of an empty house, or the sharp silence of a goodbye. It was the quiet of a blank page, waiting for the first word to be written. Vesper took a deep breath, the salt air filling her lungs, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't look back.